this is about tevila. Do disposable aluminium pans require tevilat kelim if one plans on using them multiple times? In general, what is the defining principle which would make something require tevila? He's got a second part to that question, but I think however, we could deal with that first question, that first part first.
Very well. So, if we look briefly in Rambam, Sefer Kedusha Yechot Ma'achalot HaSurot Perak Yud Zayin, Halacha Bet, Rambam says, Halokeach Kele Tashmish Se'oda Min HaGoyim Mikle Matachot Uchle Zechuchit Matbilam Tamem Mikwa V'Hakach Yu Mutarim La'echol Bahen V'Lishtot. So this halacha applies to utensils made of metal or glass, which one purchases from non-Jews. According to the Yerushalmi, by the way, the reason for Tevilat Kelim is lachnis et hakli lekedushat Yisrael, to mehanech, as it were, to do an act of hinuch and introduce this kli into the for the use and benefit of a Jew. And it's a very important concept. If one is talking about disposable utensils, then the Chaim is correct. One does not need to do tevila, but if one intends to reuse them multiple times, the answer is yes. The fact that it is a certain kind of metal and not another kind of metal is not relevant. In general, the second question I see here has to do with plastic utensils, correct?
Correct. It's quite long, so I'll just post it in the chat.
Right. The question is, the common custom is for plastic utensils is that they do not require tevilat kelim. I agree with that. I do not think it makes a difference if we're talking about thick plastic or thin plastic or silicone or what have you. All these materials, which are not metal and not glass, are patur mit tevila, because that was the gezerah as it was made. And at this point, I don't think we have any reshut, any possibility, or nor the need to tamper with that takana. Perhaps in the future, the Beit Din HaGadol will expand that takana, but not at the present time.
Thank you, Harav. Just on the issue of disposables, there is a shita that the metal that's disposable metal foil is reusable. It's just because we're rich, we don't reuse it, and therefore it does require tevila. Does the Rav have a view on that?
You're saying there are those who say that even though something is disposable, it requires tevila because it can be reused.
Correct.
Here, I lean towards the opinion that if one intends to throw it away, if that's what one usually does with such utensils, then I think what is koveh is one's da'af, that it is something which en lo be'etzim kiyum, beyond the immediate present, and one is not allowed to do so. But if one, as a matter of course, does reuse such pans or utensils several times, then it's like any other dish.
Okay, thank you. Chaim, I don't think is on the line, so I'll move on to the next question. However, we've gone well over the hour. Is there able to carry on, or
let's try and complete.
Great. Thank you, Harav. Okay, this is from Eliyahu Shofet in Berkeley, California. Do the properties of Davar Harif still hold today? Would cold meat and sharp spices being chopped by a spinning blade cause the spinning blade to have the meat taste absorbed?
Good question. The answer is yes, but it has to be qualified. In other words, really the Davar Harif does not cause the other flavor to be absorbed into the metal utensil. What it does is it is acerbic. That the chemicals in that Davar Harif, which are acerbic, cause the other chemicals, other substances involved to attach themselves, not really to be absorbed, but to attach themselves more thoroughly to the to the utensil. So a Davar Harif in some kind of spinning, chopping device with meat, shall we say, yes, it does cause the meaty flavor to attach itself because of that extra chemical compound. It is more likely to become thoroughly attached to that device, to that blade. But this is not a big problem. It's easily remedied by some hot water and soap. One doesn't have to kasher it. If one washes it thoroughly with hot water and soap, that chemical compound will break up, and that flavor will dissolve and disappear.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any Yahoo notes, so we'll move on to an anonymous question about. I'll read this one out. May one own stocks in companies that sell non-kosher food, for example, McDonald's? Are there any issues with owning stocks in companies that own or sell Hametz on Pesach? With regard to Hametz, would the prohibition apply just on Pesach or all year round?
Very well. I imagine that the question is being asked, shall we say, in the case of McDonald's, which sell, amongst other things, basar b'halav, basar that was cooked literally with cheese, shall we say. And we know that the isur of basar b'halav is asur b'hanaya, and therefore the person is asking the question: is it mutar to own stocks in such a company because you're benefiting perhaps from their basar b'halav concoction? In my view, it is mutar, because the isur of being neheneh mi basar wa halav is being neheneh directly, financially, from that concoction, from that mixture, that admixture. So if you had a piece of meat that was cooked in some cheesy sauce, and you cannot eat it for obvious reasons, but you could sell it to a non-Jew who's allowed to eat such a thing, you're not allowed to benefit and by selling it and therefore getting the money for that dish, because that is hana'ah mi basar b'halav. But if you own stocks in a company like McDonald's, you are simply a shareholder in their total worth, their value as an economic concern. It doesn't matter how that value came to be. They sell perhaps also basar b'halav, but they also sell Coca-Cola, and they sell salads, and they sell other items which are not basar b'halav. When you own stocks in that company, you have no real ownership. You do not own any of those products per se, specifically. You do not own the Coca-Cola, and you do not own the cheeseburger. You own part of their revenue, part of their market value, shall we say. And that is not the same thing in my view. I do not consider that to be a problem. The next question here had to do with owning stocks in a company that owns or sells Hametz on Pesach. Here too, in all these cases, McDonald's or other companies, we're talking about a company limited, I imagine. A company limited is a legal entity. The whole concept of such a thing is that it does the items, the food in question, shall we say, does not belong to a particular person. It belongs to a legal entity known as McDonald's, or called I don't know, Walmart or Shufelsa, whatever the case may be. Hametz, shall we say, which is owned by a supermarket, which is a legal entity in its own right, so that even the person who is the major shareholder and the owner of that business, of that supermarket, if he were to go broke tomorrow, or shall we say rather, if the company were to go broke tomorrow, you would not go to the owner of that company to ask to pay the debt, because it's a company limited. So there are certain ways that there are legal procedures as to how such a debt is to be paid off. That's the whole idea of a company limited. So there is no direct ownership between the Hametz owned by that company and the owner of that company. I do not think that owning stock in such a company is asur. For that reason, I've also said that Hametz owned by a supermarket during Pesach, that is not the same as Hametz she'avar ala Pesach that was in the possession of a Jew. If it was in the possession of a Jew, that means it was in his sole legal possession, whereas something owned by a non-human legal entity such as a company, I do not believe a company is a Jew. The company is not hayav to put on tefillin. The company is not hayav to eat masa on Pesach, and a company is not required not to possess Hametz on Pesach. And I do not think that it is therefore asur to own stocks in such a company.
Thank you, Harav. The next question is from Joseph in Yavne. It's also a long question, so I'll start with the first sentence. Being aware of the general rabbinical issue of baking dairy bread, is it a problem if it is baked ka'ein Torah?
It shouldn't say Torah, it should Torah with a U, it should Torah with an O. Ka'ein Torah, like a ox, shor, Torah. The basis of this halakha is that in order that people not eat bread which contains milk or butter or cheese with meat, therefore there's an isur d'Rabbanan to bake milchik bread which is dairy in terms of its ingredients. However, the halakha also states that if that bread is distinct in some way, it is baked in a certain way with a certain shape, etc., in a certain style, so that it is obvious that it is bread that is dairy and will not be confused with other types of bread, then it is mutar. So that applies today as well.
Okay, thank you. The next part of this question, question is whether this has now been answered. Would the isur still hold if the bread is intentionally made dairy ka'ein Torah, specifically and only for a dairy breakfast time meal, and meeting both conditions in accordance with how ka'ein Torah is interpreted, namely different shape and size, with all of it eaten during that meal and very little, if any, left over?
Allow me to quote the Torah on this question. We find this halakha. Rashi's perush as to ka'ein Torah, what that means exactly, is not exactly clear. Rashi says that it refers to a small amount, so that one can assume there'll be no leftovers. So you made a small amount of dairy bread, and it's assumed, it's quite obvious that there'll be no leftovers. So it will not be eaten later with another meal that would include meat. The Harif is quoted here by the Torah as explaining that it refers to the bread having a particular shape or size or some obvious sign that it is halavi. So, in my understanding, if we're talking about bread that is baked in such a way so that it is obvious that it is halavi and not just another piece of bread, it is mutar to bake such bread, on the assumption that all people in that area or in that household or in that city know that bread that looks like this is definitely halavi. But if the case is that not everyone knows this, and people may just see it and not realize that this shape is indicative of the fact that it is in fact halavi, then yes, it will still be asur to do so.
Okay, thank you. We now have an anonymous question. Can the Rav please share his opinion on the status of mevushal wine when in the presence of Jews who are not observant? Does contact by a non-religious Jew make non-mevushal wine not kosher?
In my view, such contact by a non-religious Jew does not make non-mevushal wine asur b'shtiyah. I say this because we all know that unless we were speaking about some entirely unexpected and almost unheard of reality nowadays, both amongst Jews and non-Jews. We are not familiar with people who take wine and make a libation to some avodah zarah. This is just not something done nowadays, not even by Christians, shall we say, which is why the Reed, Rabbeinu Yeshayahu Ditrani, writes in a Teshuvah that in his view, a non-Jew who touches wine, an open bottle of wine, the wine should be mutar b'shtiyah even, not just b'hana'ah as the Goanim write, as Rambam quotes, but also b'shtiyah, even should be mutar to drink. And this makes a lot of sense because the reason that it was asur b'mei hazal was because your average non-Jew did use wine for such purposes on a regular basis. In their homes, in their backyards, they had little shrines to this god, to that goddess, and they would just take wine from the home and do an isuch hayayin in their backyard. You didn't need a priest for this. This was something that any goy could do. So for that reason, satham yenam, not just wine that was specifically set aside for avodah zarah, but any wine which they may use for this purpose, which was again a common practice, satham yenam was also therefore ne'esar, it was made asur. But nowadays, even Christians are not allowed to do this. This is one of the principles of even early Christianity, that only the priest is allowed to do these things. And the average non-Jew, the average Christian, cannot do these things, not allowed to. So says the Reed. And this is a very powerful and rational argument in my view. The question here is being asked not about a non-Jew, but a Jew who is non-observant. So I'm saying, Kal Wahomer, from what the Reed says about non-Jews, we can certainly apply that to, I think, to a Jew who is not religious. And by the way, this is also the view of the Hazon Ish, for example, who also writes that non-observant Jews today should not be considered to make wine nesech.
Okay. What is the Rav's view on the modern practice of bishul with wine?
If the question is, should we consider wine that was brought to a certain temperature, something like 86 degrees centigrade, inside a closed system of pipes, in order to make that considered mevushal, do I consider that to be bishul? My answer would be no. I don't really consider that to be bishul, because the essential concept of yain mevushal, as explained by Hazal, refers to a product that the taste, the flavor, and the quality of that wine changes as a result of the bishul, which is true when you put it in a pot, you bring it to a boil, it does have an impact on the taste of the wine. Certainly for most people with any understanding with regards to wine. But when it is specifically done in such a way that it will not impact the taste of the wine, which is how it's done nowadays, then this is not really yain mevushal. This is not what Hazal had in mind, because they were referring to a different product, whereas this is not really a different product.
Thank you. The final question is also anonymous. The video that Rav posted last year about the history of the waiting time between meat and dairy was very informative. Is it the Rav's position that one can or should return to the original halakha? If not, how long should one wait?
There is no question that the meaning of the sugya in Masechet Hulin and the way that sugya was understood universally up until approximately 1,000 or so years ago. In other words, when you look in the earlier Gaonic sources, this is what we find also, that there was no concept of having to wait, no matter what, between meat and milk. There was a difference between different types of meat with regards to poultry, chicken, turkey, pheasant, duck, goose, etc., which is called off. In halachic terms, all of that is referred to as off, poultry. There was no requirement to wait at all. And there was no requirement even to check if one had any type of meat of those types that we mentioned, poultry, is stuck between one's teeth, which, by the way, is much less common with those kinds of meats. And one was not required to even wash one's hands between that and a cheese dish or a piece of cheese or a glass of milk, etc. With regards to basar behema, that is to say, sheep, goat, beef, game, which is also an interesting question, but let's for now assume that the din, the status of the meat of a deer is the same as that of a cow. There was a requirement to ensure that a person did not have meat stuck between one's teeth, which is much more common with those kinds of meat, and to wash one's hands and clean out one's mouth, either with water or by eating something in between, like taking a bite of bread or something similar, between that and eating something dairy. That was the way the Gemara was understood, and that is also the most reasonable way of understanding the Gemara. For whatever reason, another shita appears about 1,000 years ago. It's difficult to say why, but it's clear that it's not the original ancient practice. So if the question is, do I think is it mutar lechatchila to act in accordance with the intention of the Talmud and the halacha as it appears in the early Geonim and also in certain midrashic sources from Eretz Yisrael, early midrashic sources, I think it is definitely mutar to act in accordance with that, which means that there is no such thing as having to wait. The only time that one has to wait, according to this shita, is if one ate, shall we say, beef, and one does not wish to check if one has meat stuck between one's teeth, or one does not wish to clean out one's mouth as described, then the other option is to wait. And then you have to wait several hours, something like 5-6 hours. But that's really the lazy man's option. It's not a halachic requirement to wait. It's simply another thing that you can do instead of the other possibilities. It's another way of dealing with the situation. I think it is entirely possible and mutar to act in accordance with that halachic shita, even though it is not, must be stated, it is not a common practice by any means, and people will find it very surprising and perhaps will even become agitated if they hear that you act in such a way. And then not all people would be willing to listen to the explanation and to hear the facts and the history of the matter. And in order to avoid mahaloket, I suggest that one conduct oneself in a circumspect manner. There is no miswa to cause mahaloket and consternation.
Thank you very much, Harav. That completes all of our questions. This has been an enlightening session, so I'm very grateful to Harav for giving up his time and answering our questions.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.